Hello and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Well, the two chapters we're dealing with today are Judges 7 and 8, the completion of the story of Gideon. Remember, we introduced to him yesterday. I'm going to lift 8 principles out of the life of Gideon that reflect how God deals with us. The first one is that God wants you to know that He can intervene, He does intervene, and many of your victories are not because of you, but they despite you. So he says to Gideon, those 30,000 soldiers, weed them out. The scared ones, send them home. The ones who drink in a certain way, send them home. He's left with 300 men and the trumpets of those who have defected the battle lines. And with those 300 men, he's going to rout tens of thousands. I feel that God is wanting to say that to you today. No matter what the odds against you, now, what the enemy against you, God says, just like He used the 300 to defeat the tens of thousands, He can use you and your weakness. Number 2, God understands when you're afraid. And when you're afraid, He wants to talk to you. So He says to Gideon, are you scared? Wait. Go down at night, listen to what the enemy is saying about you, and you will be filled with courage. God wants to speak to you when you're afraid. Listen to Him, read His word, wait in His presence. He will bring strength to you. Number 3, those 300 guys had 2 weapons. They had torches like this, lamps that they lit and they put under jars, and they had trumpets. And we remember what happened is that they held their positions, verse 21 said. They blew their trumpets. I'm not too good at this Second World War trumpet that I whipped off my father-in-law's wall. But they blew that trumpet more profoundly than that, and they broke the jars so the light shone. So there were 300 men, just 300 men, encircling the Midianites. They were terrified. God magnified the trumpets. He exacerbated the shadows. I don't know what He did with the light, but they turned on each other and they killed each other. What's the principle? Well, in the kingdom, 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. 1 soldier plus another soldier doesn't equal a soldier of 2. No, 1 + 1 equals 100,000 in the kingdom. God's weapons are different to our weapons. Number 4, what happens is after this, the Midianites run away, and then Gideon summons the rest of a few tribes of Israel, and they do the mop-up operation. Your victory, your battles that you win, mean that other people that are following you enjoy the fruit of it and are able to have their own little victories in the wake of God's dealings with you. And then number 5, we see the tribe of Ephraim coming and complaining and being very divisive. And so, politics and pettiness comes into, it's just part of life. And I suppose the principle here is don't let immature people, don't let the politics of life capsize you. Gideon was very nimble on his feet. He says, listen, God's given you a part of this. You actually did an incredible job, and it subsided. Don't let immature people capsize you. Now, number 6, there were some enemies that were sort of secondary enemies that Gideon teaches a lesson, but he only teaches them that lesson after he's routed 15,000 men with these 300. I think that miracle was even bigger than the first. You see, God gives us a miracle because those first tens of thousands killed themselves, but then these 300 exhausted men chased down 15,000 and beat them. That is even a bigger miracle in my view. So success, seeing God's victory, the testimonies of what God's done before gives you courage to go again. That's a big principle in the kingdom. But this chapter ends with tragedy. Gideon looks very noble when they want to sort of worship him. Gideon says, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. It sounds very noble, hey? But then the next verses say, he had a son by a concubine, and he calls that son Abimelech. You know what that means? My dad is the king. Gideon's humility was a false humility. To name your son, my dad is the king, and then say to the people, I'm not going to actually rule over you. The Lord's ruling over you. There's a chink in the armor, isn't there? Humility is what God's asking for, especially when we win our battles. And then what happens is he asks them for their rings and their plunder, and he makes an ephod, which is what the high priests would use in their garment to discern God's will. And somehow Israel goes astray and worships that ephod. It says that for 40 years Israel lived in peace while Gideon was there. He was flawed. He was not the most humble man. His faith, as we saw yesterday, was not as mature as it should have been. And yet God used him. But the seeds of their demise was coming because they were now worshipping a man, worshipping an ephod. And we'll pick up tomorrow what happens to the children of Israel in the generation that passes Gideon. Well, I trust as you read the story, it's a bit bloodthirsty, but intriguing nonetheless. God bless you.